Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve.
Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. We started this podcast to connect to Mad Men fans like us who pick up something new with every rewatch.
Be advised, this podcast will include spoilers, so we can talk about character arcs all the way through the final season.
We'll be breaking down each episode of Mad Men, discuss the big and small moments, and pose some questions to listeners so we can get your insights. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z. Today we're talking about Episode 3, The Marriage of Figaro. Mozart composed The Marriage of Figaro in 1786, and it's the second opera in a trilogy, the first one being The Barber of Seville, the third one being less popular. Figaro is a servant about to be married, and the plot involves infidelity, mistaken identity, class and power, and the nature of love. But Figaro isn't just a stock comic character. He shows feelings like jealousy and rage, and not just for comedic effect. So when we look at this episode of Mad Men, we can tie that plot to Pete coming back from his honeymoon, Dawn and Betty's marriage, and that of their neighbors, and the complications of other characters in those relationships, like Peggy and Rachel. When I look at this episode, I really feel like it starts to get into what Mad Men is to me, whereas the pilot and even the first episode, which of course was recorded a full year later, seemed to be trying to get its feet under itself. The show is trying to find its way. And with this episode, even though it's not quite in its glory days yet, it does feel more to me like what Mad Men feels like for the rest of the show.
I agree with that, and I wonder if it's driven by the introduction of additional characters. It did feel to me like the first two episodes were relatively focused on Dawn and Peggy, and we were looking at them through the eyes of other characters. This episode really starts to expand the ensemble cast in my perspective. And we start to see that there are stories and realities for other people that we're going to learn a lot more about. And I agree with you. It really does feel like we're starting to see the show that we obviously love, looking back on it now.
Yeah. So as the show opens, this particular episode, we see Don on the train and somebody recognizes him from Fort Sill. We know he's a veteran, but the person calls him Dick Whitman, not Don Draper. What did you think about this?
I was trying to put myself in the place of somebody who hasn't seen it before, and it is a rather puzzling scene. Why is he calling Don Dick? And clearly he knows him, and we get the acknowledgement from Don that he knows this person. So it is a bit of a mystery, and I think just teeing up a question or a mystery here for us as viewers. There's something going on here, and we're not privy to it yet.
Yeah, when I first watched it, I thought, oh, this guy is just mistaken. Obviously, that's not his name. But then you see Don's reaction, and they do share memories from the past. So even though Don doesn't have any interest in getting together and he doesn't give any details, he's like, oh, I live upstate, or yeah, I'm married, but he doesn't say any names or anything. So he's uncomfortable, but you can see this guy is actually telling the truth. And we don't know, on the first watch, we don't know anything about this or why this is happening.
I was watching to see if there was any signs from Dawn of, oh, I don't know this person, you must be mistaken or whatever. And they quickly put those to rest. Clearly they do know each other, and you have clear acknowledgement from Dawn. So it sets up the mystery in a nice way, I think, because there's no question. Dawn knows this guy, and this guy knows Dawn, except he knows him by a different name.
But you do kind of wonder, has this never happened to him before, knowing what we know now? So I know that we have to be introduced to it as a viewer. So in spite of what I just said about it starting to find its feet, we know that for the audience, we need to be able to be introduced to the mystery in some way. And this is as good a way as any. But I feel like this must have happened to Don before, and he would really be more practiced at deceiving whoever it was who was calling his name.
Yeah, it could be, but it's a large country, and I can't remember where Dick Whitman grew up. Was that in the Midwest?
Yes, I'm ashamed as a Mad Men fan. I don't know that off the top of my head. I'll have to look that up.
Okay, because I'm just thinking, okay, now you're on Madison Avenue, or you're an ad man, and how many people from his hardscrabble background, which we'll learn about in future episodes, and how many people from that world would rub elbows or spot him on the train or whatever in the greater New York City area. And it's like, I can accept that this is an unusual occurrence for him.
Fair point. So this scene is doing a lot of work. It's introducing us to this mystery about his identity, which will become a really important plot point. And we also see the VW print ad beside him that says lemon, and the train conductor gives it a chuckle as he looks at it. So as Dawn gets into the office, we see Paul greet the elevator operator, Hollis, and the other boys are greeting Pete, talking about his honeymoon. And I do want to make this point because in the last episode, Paul tried to make conversation with the black man at the sandwich cart, and he greets the elevator operator by name, and everybody else is ignoring him. But neither of those people want to have genuine conversations with Paul. And he also seems a lot more about the performance of the greeting than genuinely conversing with the other human being. So I think that Weiner does a really great job showing sexism and classism and anti-Semitism authentically in this show. And I think the show is less successful showing racism, but there are these hints of it here in this very white-dominated world. And so as you watch through and you look, it is present. It is there at least a little bit.
I agree with your take that it feels like he's virtue signaling in terms of his greeting to the elevator operator. And I was thinking about for the elevator operator, how would you take that? And I was thinking there's really no upside or benefit to the elevator operator of encouraging this interaction or engaging in it. It really is fraught with peril and risk in terms of his job or how others may take it. So I quite like the writing in this particular example, even though I agree with your larger observation about the race in the series and how it's presented. I like it in this elevator scene because I was thinking if I were the elevator operator, I would feel the same discomfort.
So in the elevator, as the guys are welcoming Pete back to the office after his honeymoon and they're pressing him for details, you know from their conversation he used to share intimate details with them, but he says he's changed and he's truly happy about his new relationship and he doesn't want to sully it with discussion. He says, "You're talking about my wife here." So how do you think about the new improved Pete?
I was pleasantly impressed, as I'm on record as saying how much I hate Pete at this point in the series. And it's a pleasant surprise that he's not going to kiss and tell and spare us the lurid details, which would be highly inappropriate, especially in an elevator and with his frat boy pals. So I thought Pete showed well here as a new husband. And I think it raises the question, is he changing or what is altered in his mind at this stage of his marriage and relationship? Because to this point, he's mostly spoken of the marriage in negative terms about giving up my life and things he's sacrificing. And even the postcard, from the prior episode is so creepy and unwelcome. Now I wonder if we're getting some indications that Pete too is a developing person and we're going to go on a journey with him as a character. So I guess I like the writing because it's taken somebody that was somewhat one-dimensional in my mind and just put a big crack down that single dimension to say there's more to this guy.
I so appreciate that about the writing. It definitely is true about Pete for me too. So as they make their way into the office, we get introduced to some of the secretaries who warmly welcome Pete back. And this includes Allison, played by Alexa Alamani, who was in Masters of Sex, and she's actually a writer on some of the episodes of The Librarians. We met Hildy briefly, Pete's secretary, played by Julie McNiven. You might recognize her from Desperate Housewives, Doom Patrol, and Stargate Universe. And Pete notices that everybody is unusually friendly, and it turns out that they have pulled a prank on him. So they're all watching to see his reaction, and that's why they're greeting him with so much attention. And I admit there's a moment where I think he's going to throw a tantrum about it, but then he smiles and he laughs with the gang about this awful joke that they've pulled.
I have to admit, as a viewer, I fall for the prank. So I'm watching as a viewer thinking, why are they so warmly receiving Pete and so interested in his return to the office? So as we're talking, we're going to rave about the writing throughout this podcast, but I love that approach here because I get sucked into it as the viewer. And then only in hindsight do I realize, it's not natural. It's not. It shouldn't be that way. There's a very good reason, and the prank is rather amusing. Although there's a somewhat racist element to it as well.
Definitely racist element. But that also helps us set the tone for what seems normal at this time period in this place too.
And I agree with you. I think Pete is rather thin-skinned. And I like your read, and I think the scene does a good job of conveying he's not happy about this, but he realizes he really has no alternative but to be a good sport in this example. And he steps up and he adheres to the social norms, even if inside he's got some frustration or irritation.
So we move into our first work meeting of the day. Don has showed up a little bit late, but he's a little bit chippy in this Secor Laxatives business meeting. And he doesn't want to talk about the prank on Pete. He's not interested in giving him any extra attention. And Sal brings up the VW lemon ad. So Don says, "I don't know what I hate about it more, the ad or the product." And so we know that Think Small came out in 1959. And then Lemon, shown here in 1960, are still memorable ads in the advertising world. They show the audience that they're being honest and funny as opposed to bragging about all the high points. So this ad is really noticeable in a landscape of being bigger and better. Roger actively dislikes it. There were Beetles produced for the military in World War II, and he fought in that war. Don says he hates it, but he acknowledges that they've been talking about it for 20 minutes, so there's something there. And Pete says it's brilliant. So the age reaction to this ad is on display, with the younger people thinking it's clever and Roger's against it, and Don here is on the fence. So we get a glimpse of the changing times that we think of with the turbulent 60s, with older people being out of touch and don't trust anyone over 30, even though we're just at 1960.
I think there's two dimensions there. I totally agree with the generational split and how strong the divide is. I also think there's a professional divide being evidenced here between the true admin, the people, the creatives who make it their bread and butter to get into the head of consumers and to shape their preferences and sell products. And I put Roger and Don in that camp versus the account man he's a mercenary. He's got a financial focus. He's the business side of advertising, but he's not into the art or the creativity of it. So the professional ad men who maybe on first blush you'd think would embrace the brilliance of these ads are actually the ones panning them and panning the product as being a sort of low-end vehicle that's not offering anything special. And the young account man is the one who's seeing the brilliance of owning the criticisms and the panning and the sort of looking down the nose attitudes of the time in order to get a second glance. And we understand how successful the Beetle has been. It ends up becoming the best-selling car globally ever. And it's hugely successful by this point. It's clear that things are working well for it. It's filling a niche. It's cheap. It's popular. And these ads are groundbreaking because they're sort of doing the opposite of what the traditional admin like Roger and Don would say to do. So I think it's a great scene that shows their insecurity, because here is something that shouldn't be, that challenges their views both as an older generation and as admin. And then in contrast, we have the young, non-creative account guy saying, I think they're brilliant. So I think it's a really lovely scene. And to your earlier point about we're starting to get into the groove of what Mad Men will be, I think this is a great early example of that sort of blending and contrasting of different stakeholders and their view of things that are happening at this time.
So, of course, Roger is an account man. He's not with the creative department. He's with the business part too. But I do think that it's fair to say that it is attack on everything that Roger and Don have known about their business. So I think that definitely, it's personal, right? It's not just, I can look at that ad and find it clever. Pete has that freedom. Don and Roger are too invested in a different way of doing it. So I take your point.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point about Roger's not a pure creative in the Don sense of the word. But I think because he's the son of the founder and he's been wrapped up in this world, his mentality and attitudes are very much cut of the true, pure admin place. And like you say, as opposed to Pete, who's, it's a job. He's here because he's, a wealthy wasp who can shake hands and make small talk.
Well, and he's got some anti-Semitism there too, because he says something like, Bernbach is a Jew. Why would he want to support German cars? His time in the war has definitely influenced his opinions. And so I don't think it's just a pure resentment. I think it's wrapped up in a lot of complications.
And the war is very near at the time this scene is taking place, so the war ends in 45. We're roughly 1960. So 15 years earlier, if you put that in modern times, you realize how recent it would be, especially something as calamitous and catastrophic as the war was.
Yes, for sure. So they come out of the meeting and Pete stops by Peggy's desk, and he's a newly married man, and he awkwardly says something about it. So she says, Pete, I understand it never happened. And it's notable because she doesn't call anybody by their first name in the office. And I guess Joan, but none of the men. And while he has all the power and he's declaring what will or won't happen between them, at least he faces her and has that conversation. I guess we can give him a little credit there, because later Don is in a similar situation down the road, and he pretends like it didn't happen at all. So Pete here seems determined to try to do right by his wife, and Peggy, who has kept his honeymoon postcard secretly in her desk, She looks a little bit shaken to have that interaction. And she also looks a little more dressed up than usual, like she's been looking forward to seeing him. So it seems like she's not quite over him in spite of what she says.
I really like your point about the contrast between Pete and Dawn, because I think it's a great point that Pete could continue on. It's clear Peggy's interested. That's her expectation. And he's choosing to shut this down. And, we can speculate about his reasons and motivations. But I think it's a great contrast to Dawn, who's such a philanderer and who will cheat again and again and again, everything from one night stands to extended relationships. And in this moment, the character that, again, love to hate, steps up and says, I'm not going to continue cheating, even though at the time where he had this tryst with Peggy, it was clearly cheating because he was engaged and the wedding was scheduled at that point. I also really like this scene because I think it tells us a lot about Peggy. It's maybe a misguided hope, but it's clear that she's very young. I think she's very inexperienced, and she's thinking that what's happened with Pete is the start of something bigger potentially, and she's interested to see where it's going. And it's just such a crushing scene for her, and she can't show it. She has to sit there and take it and hold herself together, and really probably what she's been hoping throughout the duration of the honeymoon has now come crashing down. And she's getting a very hard lesson in reality of how things are going to be around the office. I just felt as a viewer really empathetic for that pain of a young woman crashing into that wall so hard and not being able to show it, not being able to escape it, and just having to internalize it and sit there.
I like that point, and I think we can give props to Peggy because the last episode where there was a woman crying in the bathroom and she went in and she was shaken and upset and she decided that's not who she was going to be. So here she is, and again, she's steeling herself and she has to smile. But at the same time, I'm sort of like, okay, Peggy dodged that bullet with Pete. Yay, you can move on. There's better out there. It's going to be great for you. So
Well, we all know Pete is a huge mistake for Peggy. So I hear what you're saying. I think this scene does a great job of showing us Peggy's strength. She's taken a shot here, a really hard shot, and she's held it together. And in some ways, is there a harder shot she could have taken at this point in her new job, in her new life? To me, it really speaks to the steel that's inside of her character. She's going to take this shot and carry on and push through, even if tonight she's going to fall to pieces in the privacy of her apartment.
yeah, I love that thinking about all the details of who these people are before and after we see them in these shots. She did have a very cringy first day with Don where she tried to be his girlfriend because Joan had recommended that to her, and to get up and see him day after day after that. That would be pretty embarrassing. So she is pretty strong to make it and take all the things she takes from all the guys in the office.
And I just think in a lot of our entertainment, this kind of quiet internal strength is relatively subtle and goes under the radar a lot. So I really like that this scene purely focuses on that and leaves you with no doubt of just how difficult this is for her. And you probably aren't even yet thinking about the strength it takes her to push through. But as you ponder it after the fact, it's really gratifying to think, okay, we know something more about Peggy. She's got reserves of strength that she can push through very difficult challenges. And she's not going to start wailing or weeping in the bathroom like some of her coworkers.
The show does not let us see her as a victim, even though we see her suffering indignity. That's a great point. Pete also stays back with Dawn after this meeting to make some pleasant chit chat. And I thought this was an interesting parallel. So Dawn is rude to him and Pete is trying to be personal. It was a little bit like Betty in the ladies' room with Mona trying to reach out and extend some personal friendship conversation, and Mona shut it down, and here Dawn is the one. So Pete says things like, Trudy's a lot funnier than I thought. I'm actually looking forward to going home tonight. And I mean, again, oh, Pete, so not okay. But, he has this genuine comment about being happy to be married, and Dawn doesn't engage. He definitely keeps his distance. So then Pete flips it back to business, but he's still trying to pry open that gate. So maybe we can get the wives together. And Don doesn't even look at him. He says what's expected. He says, maybe we can, but you can tell that's closed for him.
I love this again as an example of Pete coming back a new man from his honeymoon, trying to reset with Dawn. There are perfectly good selfish reasons for him to reset with Dawn, and it makes professional sense. But I appreciate the gesture on Pete's character's part to say, let's try and reset here. And it is especially brutal, the rejection that he gets from Dawn. And it's clear Dawn is not changing. He's not resetting. He has no interest in it. The other thing I think is interesting about this is Pete perhaps has been awakened to some of Trudy's values as a human being and a partner, and starting to reconsider maybe the callow way he was considering marriage up to this point. But at the same time, he doesn't realize that he's touching on a sore spot with Dawn, because Dawn's marriage has got some serious problems, and we're just starting to learn what those are. But Pete's thinking it's a point of connection here to say, oh, I'm now happily married like you, Dawn, and this links us, and we can extend this together and build a relationship around it, not realizing that it's probably just aggravating Dawn and reminding him of the problems he has at home.
So then we get to this scene where the office women are talking, which I don't think we've had a scene like that yet. Joan is returning a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover to somebody else. And Peggy expresses interest, and Joan says, oh, you probably don't want to read that. But Peggy's like, yeah, I'm going to borrow it. And one of the women says, don't read it on the train. It will attract the wrong element. And that's mind boggling, because Peggy is getting all this harassment from the office men just by being in the office and doing her job. So I don't know how much more harassment she could possibly endure on the train from reading this book. But that's another time capsule element of this book being scandalous and being passed around.
I love that joke in the writing about you'll attract the wrong element, because like you say, she's surrounded by this nonsense all day, every day. I also like the time capsule element of it, that this is something that's considered so risque and perhaps untoward to have a young woman reading this in a public place. I also like the way Peggy pushes back on Joan's matriarchal guidance here. Joan makes it clear Peggy shouldn't be reading this or doesn't need to read it. And Peggy makes a point of saying, I'll make that election for myself. And in fact, I would like to read it, and I will go ahead and do it. So again, I think it's another affirmation that Peggy's got some strength to her. She's got some things she wants to do, and she's not going to be easily dissuaded or led around by the nose.
As we move into the office meeting with Rachel Mencken, and I love this about the writing too, we get all these little tiny details about different characters. So Harry is telling the end of a joke about a dead wife, which is obviously a gross, inappropriate joke. And that gives us a lot of hints about how unlikable he's going to be later. So it's not the main story, but again, Mad Men is building all these people and forming their arcs. Don is clearly interested in Rachel at this meeting, and he's not even trying to hide it. He loses a cufflink, and they have a moment, and then Pete notices during the meeting, and he says to Harry afterward, I've heard things, but I've never seen Draper turn on that switch before. Pete also calls Rachel Molly Goldberg, but I get the sense that he's judgmental because he's so happy in his marriage, and he sees Don straying from his, even though Pete slept with Peggy while he was engaged to Trudy, so that's obviously hypocritical. But it's interesting how Dawn is unabashedly, I think, showing interest in Rachel at this meeting, and Rachel is returning it to some extent. And it's so obvious that Pete can see it. And then Pete also is forming this judgment and gossiping about it after.
I took the Molly Goldberg comment as an example of Pete's waspish anti-Semitism. I think there's a wonderful contrast here where Rachel had torn Dawn a new hole in the prior meeting because of his dismissiveness and unwillingness to engage her in her ambitions for her store and treat her as a serious professional. It's interesting now because it feels like Rachel gets that same treatment from Dawn's team. So it raised a question in my mind as to, clearly Dawn hasn't prepped them or given them the right guidance to say, we can't fake it with this woman, we need to bring it. So they walk straight into the buzzsaw that is Rachel, and deservedly get cut to pieces. In the midst of it, Dawn is turning on the charm, and it's separate from any owning or engaging on the professional piece. And in fact, he takes the legs out from under his team and doesn't even try and defend or argue in favor of them. He just says, we'll correct this and we'll look after it when Rachel's calling them out. And again, he gets to soar above it all with style, and clearly there is some electricity between him and Rachel. So I really liked Pete talking with Harry after the fact and speculating on all this, because Harry and Pete have got to feel a little sore about how they've been bruised by the client in that meeting. And then somehow Draper is skating through it and is probably going to go on a date or have some drinks with this woman in the future. So it's just such a contrast of the two different worlds. And again, I love the Rachel character here. She's so strong, she's so driven, and she's just slicing and dicing the weaklings who are put in front of her one after another. And it's very clear, stop putting these losers in front of her or these ill-prepared people in front of her. They don't stand a chance.
And once again, Pete is so cringy when his defense is, I've been away on my honeymoon, so that's why I haven't. In the meeting, they have this discussion about less is more. So at least they've done research. They are talking about having less merchandise in the department store and one sweater in the window. So they're presenting this, and at least they are comparing businesses that are Rachel's store's aspirational businesses now, as she asked them to, because she said, we share a wall with Tiffany's and we're trying this upscale thing. So that at least they gave research on upscale department stores. But when they recommend personal shopping and she says, hey, we already have that service, so that's part of her cut down. This is actually one of the Sterling line options for this episode. If you want to head to madmenctz.com and vote, this is one of them. So she gives Don credit for his honesty. And she says, it's hard to get caught in a lie. And Don lies all the time. So it's kind of funny that he's the honest one here. So that's our truth call out for this episode. And he says, it was ineptitude with insufficient cover, which is a great line. Then she says she'll see him later because he says, I will go visit your store. It will be me personally. And he says, it's a date.
It's a great scene. I love the way Don owns the failure here and realizes he could try and make excuses, but I think he recognizes this woman is too smart, too on top of things, and she's going to see through whatever smokescreen. And I think she appreciates that Don's character reads that well enough to then turn off the BS and just start to deal with her as a serious person, which sets up this meeting that's coming up in a couple scenes, or I guess the next scene at the Menkins store itself.
There's also this little moment between Pete and Harry when Pete is saying, do you think that happens all the time? And Harry says, who knows anything about that guy? He could be Batman for all I know, which is another good reference for this time period. But also because we have that hint that he has a different name from the beginning, that's kind of a good call out too.
And I think it also establishes that even with these people who are working very closely with Don day to day, don't really have a lot of insight and don't get a peek behind the curtain to see the man behind the creative genius. They know the professional Don Draper in the office, and they don't know much of what's behind that.
We also see Pete answering the phone saying, what do I want for dinner? And then he just orders like it's a restaurant. And he says, ribeye in the pan with butter, ice cream. I love you too. So that's her job, is to make him happy by making whatever it is that he wants for dinner. Thank you, 1960.
I think it's another little time era joke for the benefit of the viewer to just appreciate how different it is at this time, where there are these stay-at-home wives and their job really is to think seriously about what they will prepare for their husband for dinner when he comes home.
He really does seem genuinely happily married. He says, there's going to be dinner waiting for me when I get home, which makes you think about the bachelors and what it is that they actually do, since apparently after they get married, they're incapable of making dinner for themselves.
It's nice to see some genuine affection and positivity out of Pete, because our earlier views with him in the first two episodes, he just seems pure frat boy and very cynical and unappreciative. So I do feel by this third episode, he's starting to round out as more of a real human being that would have these, sometimes contradictory attitudes and views, but we're getting a strong dose of the positive in this episode from Pete for the most part.
So Dawn takes a tour of the department store Menkins with Rachel, and she chooses a new pair of cufflinks for him because his were broken in the meeting. And she chose knights, and he is not a knight for sure, but I think he kind of likes playing that part. And in their tour of the store, they seem to have a genuine connection, and they talk a little bit of business. She shows him her favorite spot, third-generation German shepherds who patrol the store at night. And she says when she was 9, she got her father to write a business clause saying all generations of the guard dogs would always be named the same thing, Carla and Leona, which I researched and I tried to find a reference and I could not. So if any listeners know what that's a reference to, maybe it's just a little girl who liked those names, but I couldn't find anything from that. And Dawn's response is, even then, you enjoy telling men what to do. And she says, for a little girl, a dog can be all you need, which plants an idea in his head for later, I think.
I also thought Dawn made a little shot at Rachel as they were looking on the second floor where the attendant was sleeping from Menkins. And Dawn says out loud, it's dark and old-fashioned on this floor. And I felt it was a bit of a shot at Rachel, who had been pitching how she wants this to be a new place and sort of follow the lead of other more fashionable places like Chanel. And I felt this was sort of Dawn getting a poke in here to say Menken's isn't that. That's the current situation, even if you want to change it.
I didn't see that as a dig so much as a business assessment that's useful. And I think she knows that. And that's why she came to them. I think it's her father, and she brings this up several times, who is sort of attached to some more old fashioned things. And they have the conversation about how they're going to lose some of these existing clients who are in there right now, because when they make those changes, they won't appeal to the people who are in shopping at the moment. So I took that as he really is attending to the real state of her business, and that is respect that she requires from him. I think we talked offline about the point about she wasn't overly judgy about this employee sleeping upstairs with the teddy bears, because it was so quiet. And I thought that was a nice moment for her too. And she could instantly fire this woman, but she had some empathy.
I do like the comment of Dawn saying that even at that early age, she enjoyed telling men what to do, because I felt that the writing was showing us that Dawn gets Rachel now, and perhaps in a way that a lot of men don't get her. And I think that must have a lot of appeal to Rachel's character, to have someone who is able to get that read. And I don't get the sense that Dawn is threatened by that at all either. You know, he seems very secure in his manhood and who he is. So as a viewer, I'm starting to look at these two and think they're such a great fit.
I absolutely agree. I honestly think if he weren't married, that she, of everybody, is the best possible partner. I know, don't come for me. I know there's disagreement about this, but I think she is the best fit for him. I don't think he's the best fit for her. And I think that she is attracted to that comment because of some of the reasons that you were talking about. I think it's a challenge, but I think it is dismissive, and it's an oversimplification. Oh, you just like telling men what to do. But that dismisses her genuine opinions and beliefs and wanting to have things a certain way, just as he does. And so it is a bit of a flirty comment, but it's also more of a dismissive comment, and it makes him a lot less appealing. And I think she's looking at him going, I know what you are, and I know you're a bad idea, but something about you is attractive. I mean, he's good looking, so that doesn't hurt. But I think she does feel seen, but I think she also knows better.
That's interesting, because on this one, I probably come off on the opposite side of the prior one we had some difference between. I saw it as a comedic remark. I read Rachel as taking it that way. So I didn't get it that he was trying to categorize her or limit her in any way. I got a sense of it's a fun little gesture of intimacy that I think she took positively. And I think it feeds directly into the intimate moment they have where they exchange a kiss.
Yes, I agree with you. I don't think she takes it in a bad way. I think his inherent sexism leads him to flirt with a comment like that, which is dismissive of her, even though I don't think he intended it to be that way. That's who he is.
And if we thought that the initial flirting and the kiss would lead to something stronger and they quickly spiral down that pathway, everything comes to a screeching halt here. As Dawn confesses he's married, she admits to having wanted to see him. They speculate about making a mutual mistake. And then it seems like the moment has passed, and now there's friction and dissatisfaction emerging from his reaction to that kiss. It's not what she expected. It's not what she wanted to have from him.
Well, this is our second option for Sterling Lines for this episode, where she says, what do you do? Just kiss women all the time you aren't married to? He says no, and we know he absolutely does, so liar, liar. She probably suspects that too, and she's shutting this down. But I love her honesty, because he says, I'm married, and she says, I sort of thought maybe you were, and that's why I didn't ask, because I didn't want that to be the answer. And I really admire her for that, because you can see her regret and her disappointment. And yet at the same time, there's no choice for her. She's going to end this. She's shutting it down. She says something about, what am I going to be, just a sidebar of your life? And that's not enough for her.
Rachel is so disarmingly honest and direct. And I think it's a problem for Dawn in that he spends his whole life concealing and hiding and basically pitching to his family and his coworkers. And now he's run into this client, and she's blunt and direct, but bringing all the intelligence and thoughtfulness along with it. It really seems like she's something unusual in his world. And I think he struggles a little bit interacting with her.
Yeah, she's such a remarkable character. And as we get back to the office here, Pete is refusing Allison. She has this funny old timey line where she says, "The grand lot of us are going to Lansky's after work." And he refuses. And he stops by Peggy's desk on the way out to say, "You look nice." So he's going home. He's defended Trudy's privacy to the guys. He's happy about dinner. He clarified with Peggy. It all seems on the level that he's happily married, but he still notices that Peggy looks nice today. And he tells her so. So do you think he's messing with her feelings, or he just can't resist? Or is he so happily married he feels like it's safe to say that kind of thing?
At the risk of being accused of being too pro Pete,
Oh,
I'm
no.
going to say that it's an honest compliment and part of this. Let's call him Positive Pete here for episode 3, who's just behaving so much better than the jackwagon that we came to know in episodes 1 and 2. So I'm going to take it at face value and say that's what makes it so nice, genuinely nice, because it isn't a tactic. It isn't a manipulation. It isn't him sniffing around at a return. It's just him being a happier, more positive person.
So we shift into home life. The Drapers are waking up. There's birthday party prep. Betty is up and busy, and Sally runs in to wake up Dawn. And we should mention here, Sally is played by Kiernan Shipka. We've seen her in previous episodes, but here she has more lines. Her recognizable projects include Twisters, Riverdale, Wildflower, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and The Last Showgirl. Way before that, here's Kiernan Shipka playing Sally Draper, and it's her birthday, and Betty has a ton of things that she would like Dawn to do. And clearly she has communicated this to him, and he's just waking up. He needs to pick up the cake and build a playhouse, and he has at least 4 beers while he assembles this playhouse. It suggests he's not having the best time with this whole project. What's your take on that?
I felt it was the first glimmer that Dawn drinks too much because there is a lot of drinking and smoking, especially to modernize. They spend all day drinking in the office, for one thing. This was the first scene where I thought he's drinking alone now. He's just working on the dollhouse, and this seems unhealthy. And like you pointed out, it seems to me to be a product of dissatisfaction or malaise. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder why that's so problematic. I mean, he's making this playhouse for his daughter. It's her birthday. It's a typical thing to do. She'll be thrilled about it. Why is this such a burden or drag for him on his day off to just get out there and knock it out? And I don't really have an answer based on what I've seen of the character to this point, why that should be problematic for him.
You're touching on some great stuff that I want to come to in just a minute. But first, I want to point out this detail. I love this detail, but he uses the powder room. And there's a moment where he looks around at the hand towels and he dries his hand on his shirt. And Betty asks him the first thing, "You didn't use the powder room, did you?" And he says, "It will appear untouched." So he knows that appearance is a big deal. And this is such a funny tendency we have of making our own homes and lives appear one way to our guests when the way we live is really different because those hand towels are never out at any other time.
And it's really just such a complete contrast to, say, the Rachel character we were just talking about. Dawn and Betty have this facade, and so much energy and attention goes into the facade, even while things are bubbling and churning behind it, which, we'll get into as the series goes. It's so interesting that it's all about appearances and keeping up their side for it. And they both understand and know that with each other. When the facade falls, they both will in the future scold each other about letting the facade fall and emphasize the need to maintain it.
Betty's friend, Francine, comes over early, so we can tell she's a good friend because she's invited over early to help with the food prep, and they're spreading peanut butter on celery sticks for kids. I don't know if people still do that, but it's cute. So Francine is pregnant, and she is smoking, and she's consuming alcohol, and they're gossiping again about their divorced new neighbor, Helen Bishop, and Betty says she had to invite her. And Francine says this would be a big event for her, meaning coming over to Betty's is a good social opportunity for someone like Helen. So again, a short scene packing a lot of details into a little space of time. As the birthday party starts and progresses, Betty is kind of bossy to Dawn here. She's like, "Go take a shower and make sure you take some videos." And Dawn is just going through the motions. So again, we talked about he genuinely hugs Sally for her birthday in the morning, but everything else has been have to, not I want to. And it isn't that Betty loves all the work either. She knows it's expected of her, and she just keeps everything going.
I like this writing a lot because I think it is such a truth that so many of us have experienced in our own families. It's the the burden and the obligation of the facade, of the celebration with the neighbors or the extended family, and all the work and prep and stress around it, so that the people who are hosting it are actually the most miserable people involved because everybody else gets to come and enjoy the fruits of it and then walk away. The burden falls on those hosting. And I think it's just a funny quirk of this culture that's really well captured in this episode and rings very true to me.
At one point, Carlton, who plays Francine's husband, he's Christopher Palaha, the actor. You may have seen him in Wonder Woman 1984, Jurassic World Dominion, or in Landman with John Hamm. And he says something to Don about how his company must be treating him all right, and he's gesturing around their nice house. And he comments, "We got it all." And Don just blankly agrees, "Yep, this is it." So you can see he does not have a genuine friendship with any of these people.
Yes, very, very parallel to the work associates who clearly don't know who he is as a person or the things that might actually interest him. So it's just hollow small talk that you could make with a stranger on the train as much as neighbor Don.
And there's this couple who tell him about an ad that they saw on TV and they ask if it's his, which I love as a writing detail because you know this happens all the time. People are like, "Oh, this ad, did you do that one? Did you do that one?" And then Don takes home videos and he sees this same couple in a private moment in a kiss and they're looking at each other with such genuine affection. And Don doesn't have that. He doesn't have it with Betty. He doesn't have it with Midge, and haven't seen her this episode. And he doesn't have it with Rachel. And he's genuinely startled. So a couple episodes ago, he was lecturing Rachel that love was invented by guys like him to sell nylons. And now it's staring him in the face. And he is both, I think, disappointed and maybe a little hopeful to see that it exists. Here's love and it's real.
It really does feel that this is poking him in that vacuum of himself and expressing a longing that he has that he tries to cover up, he tries to deny. Like you mentioned, the bold talk with Rachel in the office about love. Clearly, this gap is problematic for him. He senses his lack of it, and clearly he desires it.
So in this brilliant detail, we hear Voi che sapete, which is by Mozart in Marriage of Figaro. And the lyrics translate to, "You who know what love is, tell me what is in my heart. It's torment, it's delight. Who knows the secrets? What is this about?" And that's just perfect for everything about Don Draper and Betty and this whole show. And as Don is observing this life he's built and all the couples around him and the children, you can see his discontent.
We also get another up close and personal view of Helen Bishop at the party. She comes late, she brings a gift, but it's wrapped in Christmas wrapping paper. Clearly, that's a little gauche in the neighborhood. The other women are catty and judgmental of her, and you can tell she's not really welcome. I think when one of the ladies asks Betty why she even invited her, Betty makes an excuse that, "Oh, I saw her while out buying balloons, so I had no choice but to invite her." So Betty disavowing that she chose to invite her. It isn't clear whether that's true or not, what Betty says. I kind of wonder if the Betty character might have deliberately invited her because Helen is now living a life that I think has popped up on Betty's radar screen.
That was our double dip question last week about Betty and her relationship with Helen, because I do want to point out when she brings the Christmas paper and apologizes for it, Betty says, "Well, it should be Christmas all year round as far as I'm concerned." And the other women are talking negatively or pushing the boundaries directly to Helen. But Betty does seem a little protective and defensive of her. She includes her in the conversation about the honeymoons, but then she realizes it's a faux pas because of the divorce. And she says, "No, it's okay. Here's where I went to my honeymoon." And then the other women are talking about how the son's clothes aren't ironed, and Betty says it must be hardworking. So she is genuinely, at that point, defensive and protective of Helen.
And I think Helen comes in with elbows up. They're talking about where they've traveled to, and it seems implied to me that, oh, where did we go with our families or our spouses? Helen makes a point of throwing in that she went to Paris. She's living her best life and doing things as well. They also confront her on why is she walking around the neighborhood and that everyone can see her walking around and is raising questions. And Helen pushes back on that and says, "I'm walking to relax," and makes no apologies and seems to hold her ground as like she's going to live her life and she's not bending the knee or bowing down to the neighborhood wives clique.
And she says, I heard Einstein did it, referring to the walking. So that definitely is not meekness. She's happy to push, I think. Betty introduces Helen to the guys. And so Dawn takes Glenn to the food and the kids. And then the other men assess Helen very much like the guys crowded around Peggy in the office. It's like, oh, what's this new thing in the neighborhood? And Helen shuts that right down with Carlton, too.
Yeah, it's a great contrast to the office and the predatory behavior of the men there. I think it's the exact same dynamic here at the child's birthday party. And I think it really affirms that the wives are absolutely correct to see Helen as a threat and a problem. And it makes it clear they know darn well how their husbands behave and what to expect. It's too bad that the wives can't see Helen shut the men down because once again, she's large and in charge. She puts them in their place, and makes it very clear that she is not some sort of weak, vulnerable victim waiting to be accessed by one of them. So it's a great sort of power moment for Helen, which I think had the wives been able to see it, they might have had a much more positive feeling about Helen to know that she pushed back on their men that way.
And Carlton says, well, you better not say anything to Francine about this, too. So it's such an interesting back and forth with power and who has it. So Helen gets away from the women and the men at the party and goes back out on the deck. And Dawn comes out too. And they're not talking and they're not close. Dawn literally helped build this whole situation. The kids are playing in the playhouse that he built, and nothing about it is bringing him peace or happiness. And the kids are saying things, they're playing house, and they're saying things like, I don't like your tone, and take your shoes off. And kids have clearly overheard these comments, and both Helen and Dawn are depressed by it.
And I'll nominate this for one of the quotes of the episode when Dawn says to Helen, "Same crowd out here."
Yes, yes. So one of Betty's friends inside says, Betty, and that's all she says. And they look out and they see Helen and Dawn on the patio together. And immediately Betty knows what to do. She opens the door. She sends him to go pick up the cake. Dawn doesn't say anything. He just walks away. This party for Betty looks like it should be everything that is a success. There's an impressive gift for the daughter, and there's food, and they've gathered this big crowd, but it's not okay. And you can see that with the conversation, but you can also see it in another time capsule moment where we would not see today. We see another parent smack a kid for running and breaking a glass. And then the parent corrects the kid coming up upon him, and he sends him to his mother and is like, hey, go get your mother to clean up this mess, which is very hard to imagine anything about that scene happening today. I feel like maybe more likely to sue for broken glass damage than the kid. I
Well,
don't know.
but the part that strikes me through Modern Eyes is it's not the father of the child who smacks the child. It's
Exactly.
somebody else. And the father comes across the scene right at that moment, so almost witnesses it. And it's clear that this neighbor has struck his child. And again, with Modern Eyes, I think, oh, we're going to have a fist fight now between the men, don't hit my child. And instead, the father says to his child, you need to apologize. So the kid has gotten slapped by the neighbor, needs to apologize, and the kid's mother needs to come and clean up the mess that the kid made. So again, I thought it was a very witty comment on this moment and what the norms were and how people behaved and what was tolerated, because again, it is so distant from the world we see today.
And it's also a physical symbol of things are shattering, things are coming apart. It doesn't hit us over the head with it because we have these other details that are comic, even though they're tragic. But it is a symbol of this is not the pretty picture that we thought. So Don, he has picked up the cake. It's on the car seat next to him. And he drives back to the house, but he doesn't kill the engine. He doesn't get out of the car. He just drives away. And the cake is still on the seat beside him. He doesn't explain anything to Betty or Sally or the party guests. He just doesn't bring the cake back home. We get a scene with Betty calling the bakery to confirm that, yes, he did pick up the cake an hour ago, but he's not there.
I wondered if this was a little power play by Don, because he isn't flirting with Helen when he's disrupted and sent out to get the cake. So I wonder if the philanderer is feeling wrongfully accused, and that's part of his frustration with his life. It just underlines and puts a point on his frustration and leads to this very flaky behavior to take off with the cake because, as you mentioned when we were watching it, he could drop the cake off and then disappear, but he doesn't. He disappears with the cake, which he's got to know is going to jam up the party because it's the whole finale and what everybody's waiting for. And then, of all people, it's Helen who sails into the rescue, saying that she's got a frozen cake that she can bring over as backup. And that's what they end up running with because Dawn is gone for hours.
And that's funny because it's so clearly second best, and Betty Draper would never serve a Sara Lee cake for a birthday cake. But in this moment, it's just a huge rescue. My take on the Dawn thing, and I didn't think of this when I first saw the scene with the train because he's sitting there looking at trains, because mostly I was having so much anxiety about the fact that he had this cake with him, but they didn't have one at the party. And that was very stressful to me. But when Dawn is parked by the train tracks, he has to be thinking about the possibility of riding the rails. So we know from a future episode in a flashback in the 8th episode called The Hobo Code that as a kid, a man passed through town and made a huge impression on him, talking about being free to go where he wants. And he's left his work and family behind, and now he sleeps like a stone. So Dawn runs away from this party, but he doesn't run away from his life at this point. He might have been close to it. And that brings us to our double dip question for our listeners this episode. Why does Dawn commit to the party, the playhouse, the cake, to the marriage in the first place? I get the sense that Betty is pushed into this marriage by society in a way that Dawn isn't. So why make commitments that he doesn't intend to keep?
I think that's a great question. And I'm very interested to hear the answers from the viewers. You can leave your responses on Mad Men C to Z, and we will share those responses in a future episode, as well as provide our own responses to the questions.
That's madmenctoz.com. Much later, Dawn shows up with a dog for Sally's birthday, and she's delighted. And Betty says, I don't even know what to say. And Dawn doesn't apologize at all. He doesn't even say anything to Betty. He clearly feels like he did something real for his daughter after Rachel told him her dogs meant so much to her. And he seems very content. He doesn't seem at all sorry for abandoning this party.
And I think it tells us something about Dawn, too, in terms of how he thinks he can solve problems. He goes out and gets a dog. There's no planning. There's no discussion. It doesn't appear there's a lot of thought. It's just a spontaneous gesture of something that he's able to do materially, as if that is somehow a substitute for all the other aspects of a relationship and commitment and dedication he should have showed. I really had a sense of the two solitudes as Betty's sitting there cleaning dishes, smoking. Dawn's buzz drops off the dog. And then the episode ends rolling into P.S. I Love You by Bobby Vinton. And if anything, this episode has really revealed how unlike love their relationship is, despite all the appearances.
The song, of course, is all about mundane things happening in a life. The weather, the bedtime, and the love is a postscript. So that's a great closing song for this episode. I also want to call out to the brilliance of the writing and how Weiner shows characters are affected by seemingly trivial things other people say to them and how they carry that forward into their decisions. And that happens over and over again. In the last episode, it opened with Mona talking about their daughter going to see a psychiatrist, and then that led into Betty believing that psychiatry might be something that could help her. And here, you think in the scene that all you see is Rachel and Dawn having a flirtation when she brings up her dogs, and then it turns into his solution for this issue with his daughter and his family. I love that they carry these seemingly trivial things forward. And that really is a way that it can happen in real life, too. We're impacted by people around us and the things they say.
I love that writing, and for the same reason you do. It feels very real to me. And I think we see this all the time in our lives. And maybe it's more of a challenge with an episodic TV series, trying to lay those seeds and then have them sprout by the end of the episode or within a few episodes so you see the links. But absolutely, I think that's what's occurring here. And it feels very authentic.
That's it for episode 3. You can find us at madmenctoz.com to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to reply to this episode's double dip question. And like Peggy, we're just getting started, so please take a moment to like us, leave us a great review, and subscribe. That's what the podcast is for. We'll be back next time to discuss episode 4, New Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.